So we have some time for questions right now, and I'd like to start with any Princeton students or graduate students first to see if any of you have any questions before opening. Okay, well, anyone can ask a question. Yes.
I have a question. Thank you for the talk. Incredibly informative. I have a question about the diplomatic gifts, especially the story you told at the beginning with Malcolm. But he was concerned whether it would be seen as an appropriate gift or whether it would be seen as tribute. And so my question, and later on you said that there was a different term for each. And I was wondering, is there, and then you talked about Georgia being a tribute. Is there a historical or a geographic way that one would look at how something is determined to be a gift in the diplomatic sense as opposed to a tribute? And what I mean by that is that is there recognition of other states, meaning Europe or Asia, as being equivalents, and then therefore you can have gifts, but places like Georgia that may have a history of being tributes?
Absolutely. Yes, there is, and you see it in the way that regions are spoken about in Qajar sources. So, for example, letters that are exchanged, for example, between Fath Ali Shah and Napoleon, or Fath Ali Shah and British kings, use terms to refer to Iran and Britain or Iran and France that put them on equal status. There's no word for empire per se in Persian, but things like Dawlat-e-Humayun, which is something like an imperial state, would be used to refer to states like European states, but also other empires in the Islamic world, like, for example, the Ottoman Empire. Whereas when in letters, in correspondence, in sources that refer to regions that had historically been considered tributary or vassals of Iranian kings, like Georgia, for example, or like Greater Khorasan in the east, the language is different. They don't refer to these places as Dawlat-e-Humayun or other kinds of terms that would convey equal status. And in fact, the tone of these letters are different too. So for example, early in Agha Muhammad Khan's reign, Agha Muhammad Khan being the founder of the Qajar dynasty and the one who's really responsible for conquering many parts of the Iranian plateau, but also the northern regions, the Azerbaijan and Caucasus. In one of his early letters that he sends to a local ruler in the region of Nakhjavan, he has a very kind of dismissive and almost, you could say, demeaning tone towards this ruler, because he sees him as somebody who should submit to him, to Agha Muhammad Khan. So absolutely, you see it in the language, in the terms that are used between European states and other kind of Muslim empires, and with more historically tributary regions.
Would Malcolm have given a letter of introduction?
Sure, absolutely.
And it would have then contained these linguistic clues as to how he wanted to be.
Theoretically, I mean, I haven't seen actually the letter that Malcolm brought, for example, in that story that particular case. But yes, usually they come with a letter, and usually yes, it's sort of they're very. I mean, I should also say that they're very stylized and kind of there's a whole etiquette to Persian epistolary kind of writing. And Malcolm and other early British English envoys were, yes, they sort of abided by that etiquette.
Joanne.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating talk. I was wondering if you might consider the concept of a Turco-Persianate context, and the reason for that, of course, is the prevalence of these practices, especially in the Ilkhanid period. And I'm thinking also of Tom Olson's study, in which he addresses the whole business of gold brocade. So I wonder if you would consider, and also obviously in the context of Qajar, Qajarian and the various Turkic connections there.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising that point. That's an important point, and you're absolutely right that I didn't maybe draw that out as much in this talk. But in the broader project, I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to illustrate is that the Qajar rulers and Qajar political elite were, I mean, depends on how you want to look at it. Either they were really skilled or they were just scrambling to find kind of concepts that they felt applied to them. But in the chronicles and in farmans and in the Qajar state-issued kind of sources, the language that the Qajars use to refer to their own state is not just Persian, it's not just Islamic, it's also Turkic. I mean, the clearest manifestation of that is that in the letters and farmans that are sent, dates are given both in the Islamic calendar and in using the Turkic Mongol Turkic calendar, which is not unique to the Qajars. I mean, other states were doing that as well. But absolutely, the Qajars were self-fashioning themselves as something that's not just Persian, it's not just Islamic, it's also not just Turkic, but it's all of these things. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that maybe I didn't draw that out in this talk as much. Yeah.
I look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah, no, you raise an important point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I would agree with your suggestion. Yes.
It seems to be the word that you use as pishkesh.
Yes.
We have had it in Persian history way before the Qajars.
Sure.
If you're familiar with Persepolis,
Sure.
and you see the rulers of other countries, not the Persian Empire, bring gifts to the
Sure.
kings. But in contemporary Iran, it seems like the pishkesh, the meaning of pishkesh is very different.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. It has sort of lost its association with maybe political regimes and politics, and now has become more of a term used between individuals. But it still has that connotation of, it's not just a gift, right? It's something that you offer to somebody in order to show respect to them. Which is not to say that a normal gift doesn't do that. Right? A hediye, for example, also does that. But pishkesh does have this connotation of tribute, which has this older kind of history, which I try to sort of tease out a little bit. Yeah.
And of course, we're not very proud of the Qajar period because historically they gave away a big portion of Iran. So
Right.
whenever I hear Qajar, I'm not too proud of them.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, you raise, that's totally a valid point.
It's
I mean,
another pishkesh to
Right.
Russia.
yes, no, absolutely. That is definitely kind of a common trope and theme, especially in, I mean, you see it not just amongst Iranians, but you see it also in Western historiography, English language historiography. It's dominant in Persian language historiography, but also Persian language meaning modern Persian language historiography. But it's also a theme in Western historiography. Yeah.
Yes.
Giving was also when Jesus was born, according to the New Testament. At the nativity scene, you always see the three kings from the east. And the Christians in the Middle East, they always say it was our kings. So there must be some truth, because later on they said, oh, they were pagans. But actually, Majusian, which is in English, you say Megs, the kings were Mogs, Megs. Anyway, they have the same root as Mog, which is in Zoroastrian language, is the priest in that faith. So it is part of the tradition. I think it goes in.
Yes. No, it's not. Yeah, exactly. I think it's not something that's unique to Iranian or Persian culture. You find it in other cultures. Oh, well, yes, that case is Persian, but I mean, you find it in other cases as well. Yeah.
Okay. Over here first, and then.
Yeah. I have a question related to the Turco-Mongol. I know in at least Timurid times, the robes of honor are so central to, it's just so far and away the most important gift that is given by the ruler to the subject. And European travelers are it goes right over their heads, and they're very confused by it.
Right.
And I was wondering whether it, first of all, whether it retains that central importance in this period, and also whether Europeans continue to be confused, or
Yes. Yeah.
if they are aware of the meaning of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So it is central. First, I'll take the first part. The giving of robes and the khilat is central to what the Qajars were doing. It's hard to come up with kind of numbers, though, of how many khilats were given, and also kind of compiling a comprehensive list of everyone who received the khilat. I've had to sort of rely on multiple sources to try to come up with names of people who were given khilat and try to, reach some kind of estimate of what kinds of numbers were given. But I don't have a good number. But it was absolutely central. But there were other things that Qajar rulers did as well, like giving aid and assistance in the form of money and goods to broader society that was also, I think, central to. I mean, Fath Ali Shah, as I mentioned, more than any Iranian king since Shah Abbas, patronized the construction and the repair of buildings and construction projects. So khilat was absolutely central. I don't know if I would say it's the central thing, but it is definitely crucial. And yes, to answer the second part of your question, Europeans are confused by it and perplexed by it in their travelogues, like the ones that I mentioned, Fraser, Ousley, Maurier. They do mention these khilat ceremonies, and they also tend to depict them as superficial and meaningless, and it's another example of the decadence of the Qajar Empire, the Qajar state, and it's just a way of bribing people and these kinds of things. Yeah, no, that trope definitely continues in the early 19th century.
Over here, and then we have John.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you, I'm curious, why did you choose Qajar?
Why did I choose?
This year's dissertation.
Oh,
Why not?
Yeah, that's true. Why not?
Why? But you must have some reason for.
Yeah. Well, I think because first of all, this period of the late 18th and early 19th century is an underexplored, underexamined period in not just Iranian historiography, but I would go so far to say in broader Middle East and Islamic historiography. But that's not a good enough reason. I mean, so what that it's been ignored? Maybe there are good reasons for it having been ignored. I think the other reason is that it's actually quite an interesting and fascinating time period, precisely because of the fact that it is this kind of transformational moment in global history. And it is this moment when, the tide shifts maybe somewhat. And I find it interesting trying to explain how it is that the Qajars fit into this broader world, and then also how it was that the Qajars managed to establish a state after this period of decades of political instability. I think that's a question that has not been adequately answered and is given answers that are unsatisfactory in the sense that, the Qajars, they were just tribal, they just conquered all this territory, or they just recreated the administrative offices that had existed under the Safavid Empire, which is true. Those are both true, but they don't really go towards explaining how and why the Qajars managed to do it.
Thank you for doing it.
Okay. Well, there are also, I should say, I'm not the only one. There are other people who are now sort of picking up.
Thanks to them too.
Yeah.
Or, excuse me,
Yes.
or this era is, the history of Iran is recognized as the modernization of Iran.
It's a bridge, I
and,
think.
ties with Europe. But I have a question if there's time.
Sure.
Anyway, do you think that the decline of Qajars at the end of the 19th century has something to do with this practice of pishkesh, because it wasn't taken seriously, or the institution was declining and it had some impact on the decline?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the question of decline, right? How and why do the Qajars end up losing power? It's a question that I'm still kind of grappling with, I should say. But I do sense that it has something to do, although I haven't quite figured out what, it has something to do with the way in which the early Qajar state functioned, which in the early Qajar state, governance relied heavily on personal relationships, on these ties that rulers created with provincial khans, urban elite, the notables, people who had already some kind of local power in towns and provinces. The Qajars relied heavily on building relationships with these kinds of people. And I think there is probably something to be said about the fact that over time, those relationships were not sustainable. And I mean, that's part of the reason why rebellions happen, is because people no longer believe that their relationships with the state should be kept, right? But you know, there were also attempts during the Qajar period to sort of create a bureaucracy, for lack of a better word, right? To create offices and a centralized state. I mean, it really takes off under Amir Kabir, but there are, even in the early Qajar period, under Fath Ali Shah, there were efforts to centralize power and to create a more rational bureaucracy that relied less on personal relationships. But it's a process that's not, it doesn't develop, first of all, it doesn't develop in a linear fashion. And also the Qajars ultimately were not quite as successful maybe as some other states in doing that. So I mean, that's not a very good answer. But I guess the answer is that I do sense that there is something about these personal relations that political elite were cultivating, which helps explain how they were able to establish a state, but maybe posed problems later down, further along in the line.
Mm-hmm. John, yes.
So, well, thanks for a very interesting paper as well, nicely argued and persuasive. Can I press you a little bit on the sort of centrality of gift giving? Because it strikes me that there has to be perhaps a more significant qualitative difference between gift giving in the early Qajar regime, at least, and what went before, on the one hand, and there has to be. I wonder if you perhaps need to give a little bit more context to the situations in which gift giving takes on that renewed symbolic value. And gift giving in itself is pretty universal, right. And throughout the part of the world that we're dealing with, it goes back to the Achaemenids and beyond. So I'm looking for a sort of set of specifics that make the early 19th century contextually different and give gift giving that extra glue-like value that manages to tie together these different areas. And I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on that. I have another comment to do with robes, but...
Okay. Should I answer the first part?
Go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so I think, first of all, economically, it was central. And that, I mean, I have found records of sort of the annual revenue from the early 19th century under the Qajars, in which the pishkesh it's categorized separately. It's got a separate category in the revenue, and it varies between kind of between 2/5 and 1/2 of the annual income. So clearly, economically, it was a big portion of the money that was coming into the treasury. I think, though, there are, and the context for that is that this was a state that was being recreated. The treasury was kind of in shambles by the time the Qajars came on the scene. The maliyat, which is the other main form of revenue, which is the tax collected from the land, was the dominant form of revenue, but that also was something that was collected in a very difficult way. There wasn't a very systematic and effective tax collecting system. So gifts definitely were economically crucial. I think in terms of the cultural kind of significance, I think is also, I mean, I would say that culturally it's also central, largely because you see it in so many sources. And I mean, for me, these images from this Shah and Shahnameh, which is a book that is ordered by Fath Ali Shah to be written by his court poet during the 1820s at the height of the Second Russo-Persian War, and which is sort of, there are all these verses and passages that praise the king for being a just ruler and etc. and standing up against the Russians. Well, but there are like some of in this particular manuscript, I think maybe there's about a dozen or two illustrations, and two of them are Pishkesh offerings. I mean, I think that for me is significant, and it's and I think it has to do with this. I mean, I think the Qajars realized, the political elite realized that the state didn't have the means to enforce its rule.
That's what I was looking for. In a way,
militarily.
What's their conscious motivation?
Yeah, they realized
redeploying a traditional symbolic social value.
Right.
Within what's effectively a fiscal context.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think the Qajar rulers understood that they don't have the means to go out and sort of control areas, especially in the peripheries. I mean, Fars and Azerbaijan are for the most part, they're successful in control. Khorasan in the east continues to be a problem throughout the 19th century, and at some point in the mid-19th century, the Qajars just give up on the eastern parts of Khorasan. So they realize that they have problems governing the peripheries, and one way of maybe trying to get around that problem or addressing that problem is through these pishkes.
My comment was just on robes. There is, I wouldn't call it substantial, there are a surprisingly large number of Iranian or Iranic loanwords in medieval Greek, for example.
Okay.
Beginning in the 6th century when Sasanian East Roman relations were direct, and then continuing through the Abbasid period and beyond, particularly in the Ottoman period, mostly words for clothing, but also words for food, of course, much more obviously. And they're still around in modern Greek dialect vocabulary today. But that tradition of Iranian loanwords, and you can trace it back to the classical period as well. I mean, Herodotus, there are words for weapons and so forth, which have stayed in dialects of Greek, which are introduced in the Achaemenid period. So that tradition of Iranian Greek sort of transfer, and of course it goes the other way as well, is very ancient.
Okay.
But it's interesting that you mentioned the robes and their symbolic significance, because quite a number of, I'm going to exaggerate, 3 very important medieval Greek words for symbolic robes are Iranian in origin, apparently.
That's very interesting. I did not know that. Thank you for that.
I think Matthew Caneva has looked at this in a lot more detail.
Thank you.
Yes, Michael.
Okay, just going back to John's first question. I was very struck by your estimate of 2/5 to 1/2. And I'm kind of wondering, without being able to quote any evidence, but whether in the same period in the Western Middle East, if you went to the Ottoman Anatolia, Rumelia, or you went to Egypt,
what the numbers
you would find, that's right, which makes me, as a British chauvinist, want to say, maybe Curzon had a point.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think, first of all, I should, confess I'm ignorant what the percentage in the Ottoman Empire was, but that should probably be something that I follow up on. No, I think Curzon had a point in the sense that he was onto something, that gifts were extremely important in the Iranian context, but I do think that he maybe pushed the case a little too far and kind of lost sight of what function it may have served the Qajars. That it wasn't simply, grounded in these, in sort of the decadence of the Qajar state, but it had a political. It served a political function, and it served an economic function for the state. That the state couldn't really get around, at least in the early 19th century. Curzon is also writing in the later 19th century, so the later 19th century is slightly of a different story. But I mean, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, Curzon, I'm not saying that Curzon was wrong per se, but simply that he may have overstated the point. Okay.
Okay, I think one more question. You had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, this may be an invalid question, but I'll ask it anyway. When you showed the two decorations, the Ottoman and the Iranian, it struck me that the Ottoman, this is a European kind of ornamentation,
yes.
And the Ottoman one here is just a few years after, excuse me, the French Admiral de Bonneval showed up in Istanbul to start reorganizing the military before the establishment of the Nizam Jadid. And then I started thinking about Qajar painting, which was very Western in many ways, and many decades before that same influence appeared in the Ottoman Empire. And so my question is, as the 19th century went on, did the Qajars perhaps change the kind of presence they were giving to the West? I'm thinking of those large sort of imperial portraits that they did, that I'm sure they sent off to the Habsburgs and the Russians to say, we too are a magnificent people just like you. Did they do that to try to change the conversation about the gifts instead of these robes that the Europeans?
Yeah, no, absolutely, that's a really good question, and I didn't mention that, and it's a good point actually, but actually the giving up, for example, paintings, begins actually from the early 19th century. So if you go, for example, to the India Office Reading Room of the British Library, you will see there are paintings up on the wall there, and there are at least one, maybe two, from the early Qajar period. One of Fath Ali Shah, I wish I had brought an image actually, that had been gifted to the East India Company representative, who brought it back with him to England. There are also numerous paintings of Fath Ali Shah in the Hermitage collection in St. Petersburg. And in France as well, you find paintings of Fath Ali Shah and some of the princes under Fath Ali Shah. So the giving up paintings begins from the early 19th century. And you're also right to point out some of the stylistic elements of Qajar painting. One of the interesting features of early Qajar painting is that Fath Ali Shah had his painters, people like Mir Ali and Mirza Baba, emulate some, I mean, I'm not an art historian, so I should sort of say with a caveat that I'm going out on a limb here a little bit, but based on my own sort of research on this topic, the style of painting in terms of the pose that Fath Ali Shah is sitting in or standing in, and sort of the objects that are depicted in the painting, it's pretty clear that he's emulating European royalty. And you could have a debate on sort of the quality of the art, but clearly the idea is there. And yeah, I think the one analysis of that is that Fath Ali Shah is clearly trying to present himself as somebody who's on par with Napoleon or, you know, other European monarchs.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and let's give Assef Ashraf another round.
Thank you.